All right, it's 1:45. I think we can go ahead and get started. Before I begin, how many people here have heard of Dagster before, just out of curiosity? No? Okay, no worries. The lessons here are not related to Dagster necessarily, but how we educate people to use our open source framework, Dagster. The title of this talk is Enabling Community Education with a Little Help from AI. For my background, I'm Colton Padden. I'm a developer advocate here at Dagster Labs. My background's in data engineering and software engineering, but then I transitioned to developer advocacy at Dagster Labs, where I'm helping educate end users use our product. And really, I'm supporting and voicing the needs of our community. Additionally, I work on dogfooding our product, which just means testing it internally, and doing some of the feature development itself. Before I go into how we educate people on how we use Dagster, I need to talk a little bit about what Dagster is. So it's an open source project. We have looks like around 14,000 stars on GitHub right now, so we have a pretty decent community, and we are an orchestrator. This is a tool used by data engineers, machine learning engineers, data scientists, a lot of people to develop data pipelines. And you can see on the left here a quick snippet of the code you might write to build a data pipeline in Dagster. And on the right, you can see how in Dagster we would represent that. So we end up building this lineage of nodes of the things that are being produced by your data pipeline. And it's both this framework for defining the code, but also a suite of software that you can deploy and run. And we have like a web UI where you can see the jobs that you're running. It has a lot of different features, so you can schedule your jobs. It has resiliency via retries, and it has a lot of observability. Things like alerting on failures, getting this lineage view of all the different assets being produced by your data pipelines, and it has a built-in data catalog. The TLDR is Dagster is a framework for building workflows in a declarative way. Dagster also has a really great community, and that's why I love working here. So we like to highlight people with this awesome Dagster list, so we always have people contributing different projects. We also have some pretty cool logos from enterprise customers using Dagster too. So you can see here we have like Shell, T-Mobile, AMD, Kraft Heinz. If you wonder how they figure out the logistics of their hot dogs and American cheese, they use Dagster to pull in factory data, grocery store data, things like that. And we also just have really great community members. So we have a pretty active Slack with over 14,000 people there. And I really just wanted to highlight these community members like Zach Romer, Georg, Daniel, who often respond and help people like me, developer advocates, answer people's questions. But despite all of the help and like our great community, we still have a problem. And every now and then we'll get these messages on our GitHub that really don't feel good to hear. Here's one example. It says, in response to a GitHub issue, this was a major blocker that took months to resolve as this solution was not documented anywhere. The delay and inability to debug this in a timely manner led to my company to forgo adopting Dagster. And as somebody who's responsible for like the educational material and the documentation, that's kind of the last thing I want to hear from a community member. And there are a lot of reasons why I think this happened. To start, Dagster, the framework, is inherently complex. There are a lot of different use cases. Like I said, machine learning engineers, data scientists, they all use it. And they all come from different backgrounds, too. The framework is continuing to evolve, so we continue to release new features, deprecate old features. So we have to make sure the documentation stays up to date with that. And also, the learning curve of the concept used in Dagster are complicated, too. So if you're not super comfortable with Python, right away we have you using like Python decorators on your functions, which if you come from like a SQL background or you're a data scientist who mostly works in like dashboarding tools, you might not be familiar with those kinds of things. So we're responsible with educating people on these core concepts as well as like the features of the Dagster framework. Additionally, I kind of alluded to this, but there's a lot of different personas who use Dagster, varying programming skills. This Balmer peak isn't necessarily relevant as it's how your blood alcohol concentration can affect your programming ability, but similarly, we're targeting a bunch of different programming levels in our documentation. And also, in today's day and age, we're also targeting a new persona of vibe coders who are looking to be able to use our framework just through an LLM. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're enabling them later in the presentation. I wanted to give you a little bit of background about our team that is working on this educational content. So we have one technical writer named Nikki. She's fantastic. And we have 3 developer advocates. And then outside of that, we're constantly relying on the rest of the team at Dagster, so the core engineers and the community members. But as you can imagine, with like 14,000 people asking questions, having 4 people working on this content can be a little bit overwhelming. So I'll talk in this presentation later as well on how we're like scaling ourselves. Okay, so we established the problem. What is our strategy to solve it? First, we did a full content audit of everything that we're documenting, all the educational content that we're producing, and we are figuring out where we need to fix things. We also have already done this, but we revised the information architecture. And to elaborate on what information architecture is, it's kind of like the hierarchy of how you're presenting information to somebody. And also, we're trying to ensure that we meet the needs of all the different personas who are using our educational content. And then also, we wanted to build feedback loops so that we can continue to improve things. Because before, it was like going unnoticed, where it's like, oh, we're not discussing this given feature, and now somebody doesn't know how to use it, and then they don't want to use Dagster. So we need to be able to identify our shortcomings. And then finally, we're scaling our team to be able to do more than 4 people could do just manually. Okay, to elaborate a little bit on the information architecture, in our documentation, so at docs.dagster.io, you can actually see our full information architecture modeled in the sidebar of the documentation. So we revamped this by adhering to the software development lifecycle. We explored a lot of frameworks for information architecture, and there are some out there, like Diataxis is really popular. But because Dagster is a developer tool, we decided it makes the most sense to model our documentation, our information by the software development lifecycle. And in this process, we migrated off of this home-built Next.js application for docs to a framework for building documentation called Docusaurus. And this allowed us to spend less time actually developing the doc site and more time actually working on the content. It might be a little small, but you can see on the sidebar, we really try to like introduce you with a quick start, then we walk you through tutorial, and then we kind of go through the software development life cycle of like building something, then like deploying it to production, validating that it's operating as you would expect. Then we inform people on how to like write unit tests and all those things. This is just a before and after of the rewrite of our documentation. So we actually rewrote everything. Like we did like an all hands on deck. All the engineers dedicated a week to rewriting our documentation. And on the left is our custom Next.js site, and on the right is our new Docusaurus version. And you can see we start somebody with just like a really quick snippet of code so they can get started as fast as possible. The objective is just to get them up and running, and then they can decide what pathway to go to next. So we have the left sidebar for like learning the tutorial, digging into the core concepts, and then we have that top navigation bar for examples that they can copy and paste, and then like an API reference. And these are all targeting different personas. Like I said, we have this first entry point in the documentation, and then we have these examples, and I want to kind of elaborate on the different personas that we're targeting. So you could imagine when you're looking at like the core concepts and you're just reading the documentation, that's just for you to understand how to use the framework, what are the concepts, what do you need to know. But then we also offer these examples, which is like stuff you can copy and paste. And there's like 2 different people. Like I heard a story of one guy who likes to read our documentation before he goes to bed at night. He wouldn't be reading the examples necessarily, but like those core concepts and the fundamentals are more important to that individual. But these examples, we wanted to find like cool, like trending examples that you might use Dagster for. So we have that one example where you're like solving the New York Times connections using dspy and Dagster. We have an example of using Modal for podcast transcription. Just like really cool things just to showcase what the product can do, and then people can copy and paste that and try to like cater it to their own needs. For those who are like in the weeds already and doing their development, we have an API reference. A lot of times in your editor, you already have access to this, but this is for those people who might want to look through the web API reference. And for those curious, we're using Sphinx to build the documentation. Dagster at its core is written in Python, but then we're using Docusaurus, which doesn't support Sphinx out of the box. So we had to write a custom extension of Sphinx to output to a format that's compatible with Docusaurus. If you're curious about that, you can talk to me afterward, but that was quite an ordeal in itself. I asked Nikki before this presentation what reading materials she might recommend for somebody looking to improve the information architecture of the knowledge base of their project. And she said that not all of these are necessarily about tech or developer tools, but how to make sense of any mess, information architecture for the web and beyond, and every page is page 1 were all good reads according to her. So I encourage you to check those out. Okay, so we talked about the documentation, but there's a lot more content that we're producing, and I kind of wanted to briefly talk about those, because those come into play too when we talk about how we're using AI to improve this content. So we have blogs, And this is targeting a different persona, more like those newbies or those people learning Python for the first time or just completely new to Dagster as a product. So this one was like a primer on Python packages. And this one's for data people, so we kind of just assume that maybe you don't have a software engineering background, but you still need to understand how Python packages work to use the Dagster framework. So we have content like that on the blog. You might have seen at our booth, we had some books that we were giving away. We have an ebook version as well, but we created a primer on how to build data platforms. And this isn't even entirely about Dagster. So we talk about architectures for all sorts of ways to do data engineering and machine learning engineering in this book. And this is also for that persona who just wants to sit down and read, and they're not necessarily building something at the time of reading it. We have the realest of real-world examples, and that's our internal data pipelines that we use at Dagster. So it's kind of meta, but we use Dagster at Dagster to do analytics on Dagster. So we have a serverless offering where we host Dagster for people, and we want to see how people are using it. So we have data pipelines on that, and we've open sourced it all. And a common feedback we got in our documentation is like, oh, this is cool. Like, you solved the New York Times connections puzzle, but like, how do I do a real-world analytics workload? And it's like, okay, well, check out how we're doing it. This is a production instance that we've open sourced. We've also looked into doing courses, and these have been pretty darn successful. So we have an introduction of Dagster Essentials. I have these numbers in the wrong order, but there were 16,500 completions of this Dagster Essentials course, which is just so awesome. And because of that, we decided to create a couple other courses too. So how to use Dagster for ETL workloads specifically, and then how to test with Dagster. And again, like, there's some people who like to read documentation, some people who want like the handheld guidance through a course, some people just want to watch YouTube videos and things like that. And we're trying to cater to all of these different demographics. And AI is making it a lot easier for us to do that because it's really good at translating between mediums. So we're using a lot of times the same core, like, fundamental information, and then just generating various forms that we then present to people in different ways, which is what I say here. So AI makes it easy to translate between content mediums, and that's kind of like one of our superpowers lately. Even like having a team of 4 people, like, it's a lot of work to like write a book. It's a lot of work to write a course. But when you have this repository of information that you can reference, you can then like make it a lot more easy to produce these other forms of content. So we're scaling ourselves through like this use of AI, but we're also scaling ourselves through enabling collaboration. And I think this is super important in open source projects. So before, our contributing.md file in our GitHub repo might not have given you all the guidance you need to be able to contribute to documentation specifically. Like, when we first started, it was more like, oh, you want to contribute to the core framework, the software side of it. But we realized, well, we want people to be able to write documentation too. So we really revamped our contributing file. And this was really good for both like external contributors, but also our internal like core engineers have referenced this file to be able to help us in writing documentation. And a really cool discovery that I had while working on this is this contributing.md file is also really great for like Claude Code or Codex or these AI tools because it's telling them how to write documentation. So when you're referencing like some like framework code and you say, hey, I want to generate a document on this, you can tell it, oh, we'll reference the contributing.md file when you generate it, and it'll be in the structure that you would want for the docs. I mentioned that we're using like AI to generate things, but we're really scaling ourselves even more with AI through something called Ask AI. So we created a custom bot to answer people's questions. Before, I showed you that there were like 14,000 or something people on our GitHub, and they would just ask us questions after question, and like we would respond to as many as we could, but it just became too much, even with the help from the community, which is great. So we're like, okay, well, we have this context store of all of our documentation. We can train a model on that to help them answer their questions themselves. And after they ask these questions, we're also doing analytics on that. So we're seeing what questions they asked, and then we say, oh, well, they're asking this question. We must not be covering it well in our docs, like if the bot can't come up with an answer. So then we refine our documentation. We really end up in this feedback loop of people are trying to figure something out, their needs aren't being met, and then we refine it, and then start from the beginning again. And here's an example of Ask AI. So it's both embedded in our community Slack channel and in our website. And it gets so many questions. And there are varying degrees of complexity. So you can see Matt Nzinski here asking a very specific question about this Dagster DBT library. They want to define a select field on a configuration. And it just gives them the code. It's able to produce that for them. And then we have another user here named Brandon who's like figuring out how to deploy Dagster to a client cluster using Helm charts. So I wouldn't be able to answer these necessarily off the top of my head, but we've enabled ourselves, or enabled our community to be able to answer these questions themselves through this tool. And it can, do a wide array of different content types. And I want to talk briefly how this was implemented. So we used a tool called Scout. And if you guys have any suggestions for like open source frameworks for building these kinds of LLM workflows, definitely let me know. The ecosystem's evolving super fast. But we use Scout, and essentially what you do is you give it access to your documentation. You can post data to an API. So we're like scraping our GitHub discussions, GitHub issues, code itself, and we're like loading those into these vector databases in Scout that they call collections. And then we can reference those in like prompt engineering. So you can kind of see it there on the right, but we have this big long prompt that's like, you're an expert data engineer who's doing support for Dagster. You're going to answer these questions from the community members, blah, blah, blah. Then we give it access to our documentation, GitHub issues, and things like that. And it's worked phenomenally well, but it required quite a bit of prompt refinement. And we also continue to explore different models too. So right now we're using, I think, like Claude Sonnet, possibly, one of the Anthropic models. And it's getting better and better. And I should also say, like we're using this both for our community members and internally too. Like oftentimes people ask me a question, I'm like, oh, I don't know. I'll ask our Ask AI, and then I'll be like the human medium responding to them, just asking AI myself. I'm phasing myself out. And here's another example of how you use Scout. So essentially you define these like custom workflows that are nodes in a DAG, and each one is like a prompt. So you get an input, which can be like a message from Slack, and then you have this like LLM prompt that validates the message, kind of like triages what it's asking, and then we have another prompt here that like branches it off into different sub-prompts to try to get the answer that they need. The biggest takeaway, I would say, from this foray into improving our documentation and in the age of AI is that context through documentation and like educational material is more important than ever. I think technical writers are like the most important role in a lot of teams right now. The content that they're creating, the docs, the educational content, everything is really what's training these models to be able to do things. And this is both for like people using LLMs to generate code for your framework and also answer questions. But having a really solid source of truth of information is imperative. Okay, so we talked a little bit about how we did like a revamp of our documentation. We talked about how we're like trying to scale beyond ourselves by enabling people to answer these questions on their own using AI. But we're also using AI for a lot of different things too. And this is evolving super fast. But I've been using it a lot for writing. And this is like a mixed bag in terms of the reception I get from AI-generated docs. We still have like a human review every single thing we generate. Nikki is like really fast. She's like a great reviewer, but we've been exploring using Claude Code and Codex to generate like a first draft of our documentation, and then we'll review it. I wanted to say that Dagster isn't a monorepo, which means our documentation lives alongside the framework code, lives alongside every example, like everything is just in this huge repo. And I found that that works really well for these AI tools. I personally use Claude Code all the time, and I'll say, hey, look at this implementation of like this declarative automation feature of Dagster, which I don't know anything about, and like explain to me how it works. And then it'll explain it, and then I'll be like, okay, now can you write a little tutorial on how to use it? And it'll write that. And then like I'll go through the tutorial, validate that things look good, and then we can produce a document from that. And I also mentioned, I have a bullet point here, that it works really well for translating between these mediums, but it's really good at taking like these API docs that engineers are working on and converting those into tutorials as well. It's also really good at reviewing content. So I started this presentation by just writing a big long outline in my editor, and then I pointed Claude Code at it, and I was like, hey, does the flow of this make sense? And it was like, no, that's horrible. Like, you should reframe this here and there, and it like revamped this presentation. And it told me like, oh, you might want to talk about this too. So it's like really good at reviewing documents. I think like it's not going to take anybody's jobs anytime soon, knock on wood, for this kind of task. You still need like that final human review. But I've had good success with reviewing content that I write too. And then this one's not necessarily as related to documentation, and it's a bit more complex, but we're exploring using AI as an evaluation framework. And this just means we're going to use our documentation as like the context store, and we're going to say, hey, generate some Dagster code that ingests data from a Postgres database and replicates that to Snowflake. And then we'll have a test suite that runs to see if that generated code works. And because it's referencing our documentation, if that code seems to work, then we can kind of assume that, oh, our documentation must have good enough coverage that it knows how to produce the code that we need. And then we can kind of think, well, if a robot can use our documentation to generate code, then it probably can work for a human too. But this is something that's still experimental, and we're just seeing if we can build like a test suite for the coverage of our documentation as an evaluation framework. Some things that we're continuing to explore as well is just figuring out how we can better support the community, triage GitHub issues, generate solutions for issues that people are opening in the GitHub repository. There's a lot of tools in this space. We've looked at just building some ourselves and running them on Dagster. Dagster being an orchestrator, it kind of lends itself nicely to that use case. And then we're trying to figure out how to better expose this context to people using AI tools. One of the ones that seemed to be gaining traction was this one called llmstxt.org. And all that does is in your documentation at /llms.txt, you can host a refined form of your docs, but just a big text dump, and then people can point their models at that, and it can have the information that it needs. It's like a mixed bag. I really don't know how many people are using it, but we're exploring that. And then we're just continuing to try to enhance like our content auditing and just ensuring that our documentation has the coverage that we need. But again, in this space, if there's anything exciting that you guys have heard about, please let me know. Cool. So what are the takeaways? The big question is, like, are things improving? Are we still getting those messages from community members? And the answer is kind of. Like, we're still getting, like, people, we haven't solved everything, but I do think things are drastically improving. For sure, contributing to our documentation has improved significantly. Both internally, a lot of core engineers are now writing more documentation. People are opening PRs supporting us. And education has become like this core thing at Dagster that is really important. And I think a lot of that is fueled by the craze of AI, where documentation is like this really important thing to the context of these AI models. And Ask AI has been really successful too. It's answered over 16,000 questions just in September, and that is more questions than I would ever be able to answer. So it seems to be working for folks. You might ask, well, if they're asking questions, there's probably a problem too. So we're like trying to evaluate the questions that people are asking and seeing if we can get them the answers more easily just through the documentation itself without having to rely on this other tool. But the conclusions from this talk are educational material, the information architecture and the context are more important than ever. If you're a technical writer, if you're a developer advocate, just like working on knowledge stores, I think it's super duper important. It's really important to listen and empathize with your community members. The reason we started this entire project into improving our educational content is because we were getting these messages from our community members, which really hurt to hear, but we're trying to get better. And then a big takeaway is if you have a small team, try to automate as much as possible. Try to enable people to do your job and like help you and contribute to the project. And then just try to scale yourself as much as you can as your community grows. Thanks.